Hello everyone, welcome to my shop. In this video I'm going to be doing an install of new DCC compatible Bilstein B6 shocks, as well as some 034 Motorsport upgraded shock mounts on my 2016 Volkswagen Golf R Mark 7. I'm going to get the vehicle up in the air, get the wheels off, and we'll go ahead and get started. For this install, I'm going to be using some brand new Bilstein DCC compatible B6 shocks. As I said, I'm going to be using the 034 Motorsport Street Density line mounts, as well as you will need new mounting hardware for both the upper shock mount as well as the lower shock. These are one-time use fasteners, do not reuse them. I went ahead and purchased new top dust caps. I'm going to reuse the bump stop and the and another dust cover off of the factory shocks. You'll see that later in the video. For this job, other than what you need to get the vehicle in the air and keep it stable, you will need ideally an impact wrench. You'll need a torque wrench, ratchet, various extensions. You'll need a 14mm, a 16mm, and an 18mm socket. You'll also need an 18mm wrench, as well as a T20 Torx, a 5mm Allen key if you're installing the Bilsteins. You'll need a 17mm through socket in order to tighten the upper mount for the Bilstein shocks. You'll need a 5/8 or a 16 or 5/8 or a 16mm socket to remove the factory top nut if you are doing so. You'll also probably need some vice grips. A bench vise would be helpful. Some diagonal cutters would also be helpful, and a paint pen as well. You will also need a breaker bar and probably a pipe in order to be able to tighten some of the bolts. They are torque plus angle, so you will not want to use your torque wrench to tighten those. I've got the car in the air, I've got the rear wheels removed. I'm going to start videoing on the passenger side. The fuel door and the fueling system does make for some additional stuff that we're going to have to worry about removing in order to get the upper shock mount out. But the first thing we're going to start with is removing the fender liner. There are a bunch of T15 screws in here that we're going to have to remove. So you got 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There would be a 7th one here. I have mud flaps that are there. There's 8, and we got, looks like 9, somewhere around 9 or 10. I'm going to go ahead and remove these, and then we'll go ahead and start pulling out the fender liner and see what we've got to deal with. I've removed all of the Torx head fasteners. They are actually T20, not T15 like I said before. So at this point, I'm going to pull the fender liner out. Do be careful if you ever drive your vehicle anywhere there's gravel or dirt. There will be a lot of debris up in here, so just kind of watch it as you pull it out. It does come out pretty easy. You do have to kind of lift up on the front. It's kind of tucked into a spot here. So pull that out. Kind of watch your paint. Set that aside. And here we see why I'm doing the passenger side first. You can see this upper left bolt for the upper shock mount is blocked by the charcoal canister. So I'm going to actually end up removing this bolt down here and pulling the charcoal canister to the side. There should be plenty of slack to kind of move it enough to get to the bolt. There's a couple hoses and stuff up here. So I'm going to go ahead, remove this bolt, kind of pull this out to the side and secure it so that it's out of the way, and then we'll get to removing the shock. I removed this lower bolt. Trying to get this out took a little bit of figuring. I've actually pulled it out and put it back in once just so I could figure it out. So there is a hook up here at the top. You don't even try and see it, you just can't. You need to basically pull out, up a little bit, and then kind of work. Say wiggle a little bit, pull out, and it'll come down. I don't know if I'll actually be able to show it. You can kind of see you've got a hook there, and then I don't know if I can actually, I'm careful here. I don't really like that this is hanging, but you can actually see maybe, yeah, there's the clip that it actually hooks to, so that kind of holds the top in. And as I said, there's a little clamp on the back side here that goes up in that. I'm going to go get something to secure this up out of the way. Probably just a quick zip tie up to this bracket here. That way I've got some room to work, and then I'll come right back. I've now secured this with a zip tie, but I can pull it out of the way to get to the fastener before I go any further, I need to take care of a couple of things. First, because these are DCC shocks, I do need to disconnect the electrical connector. There is a push tab. Should be able to push that in, wiggle the connector loose, and then there is also this cable connector kind of clamp here. Just pull that out. Just make sure that you get your wire out of the way, protected somewhere. You don't want to risk damaging it as you're pulling parts out. Before I start to remove the shock, you do need to unload the shock. Right now the spring has got some tension on the shock. You don't really want to try and unbolt the bolts. You're stripping things. So if your vehicle's on jack stands, put your floor jack underneath the knuckle. I'm going to use this little stand here. You don't need a ton of pressure. Just be very, very careful as you're doing this so that you do not unsteady the vehicle, especially if you've got it on a lift like I do. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and probably remove this lower bolt first. I believe that these are 18 millimeter nut and bolt on both sides, so I'm going to go grab my impact, disconnect that bolt, try and get that bolt loose and out, and then we'll work on getting the upper part out. The lower bolt is completely out now, so now I'm going to work on getting these two upper bolts out. These are both M16 fasteners. I'm going to hit these with the impact to back them out. Just kind of pay attention. I said you do need to make sure your arm's supported and everything else, and just kind of watch it as things come out. Well, all the bolts are now out. And kind of pull down on the shock a little bit to get it to free up and clear out. And then it's just a matter of working it out from the bottom. Watch all your wires and everything. And now the shock is removed. At this point, we'll kind of start going through what you need to salvage from the shock, and set it up over at the bench, and we'll start setting up the other shock to go back in. So I've got the old shock and the new shock over on my bench. As I said, I am going to be using a 034 Motorsports new upper shock mount. This mount is supposed to be a little bit stiffer. One of the reasons I am changing mounts, one, it's easier because I don't technically have to take this shock apart at all. I could just assemble this one to go. The other reason is I've got a clunk in the back, so I think one of my mounts has failed anyways. So what I'm going to do I'm going to go ahead and take this apart because I did not think to buy this dust cover. I have the top cap, I have this, I have all the hardware I need, but I'm going to try and salvage this. So I'm going to clamp this up in my bench vise and show you a way you could get it apart, just in case you are going to try and reuse any of these components. I've got this clamped up in a bench vise. I said if you're going to reuse this mount, be very careful how you clamp this up in the vise, because you definitely don't want to damage this mount. As I said, I'm not, but just in case, just take a small screwdriver, pry the plastic cap off. This is where it starts getting challenging. You either need some specialty equipment, or in this case, since I don't care about this shock because I'm not reusing it, I'm going to go ahead and clip this zip tie off for this dust cover that I'm trying to salvage, pull it down. Actually, didn't think about this. I actually do need the bump stop and everything off of this as well. So I actually do need a fair amount of parts off this. You can see up here there's a tang that you have to hold to keep the shaft from rotating, and then there's a nut I'm going to have to remove. Normally you would need a through socket to be able to grab this so that you can grab the tang and get to this. Sometimes you can use something like a spark plug socket. I'm not actually sure what size this is yet, but because I'm not reusing this shock, I'm going to go grab a set of vice grips and just grab onto the shaft, because this shock is toast anyways. So I'm going to go grab some of those parts, figure out what size socket this is, and get this impacted off so that I can remove the shock and salvage the parts I need. Alright, as I mentioned, I grabbed the shock with a set of vice grips to keep it from turning. I said, only do this, I'm only doing this because I'm scrapping the shock. Just for reference, this is a 16 millimeter hex, but also a 5/8 socket works, which could have potentially used a 5/8 spark plug socket, but now I should be able to work this out. So now I've got the bump stop that I can retain, as well as the mount if I needed to, and then I'm going to remove this dust boot so that I've got it to use on the other mount. So before I assemble, this is going to be the order of assembly for the new shock. Said I am reusing this dust boot and this bump stop. Said new mount, new dust cap. I could have bought all new, but I figured these parts were probably okay. So I'm going to assemble the dust boot down onto the shock, then put the bump stop down on. We'll install the motor mount, the 034 Motorsport mount, washer, nut. I'm going to go ahead and clamp this back into the vise, and then I'll show you how to tighten it up. All right, so I've changed up how I have this clamped into my vise. I'm using some soft jaws very high up on the shaft, up where the bump stop is, so I don't have to worry about damaging the new shock shaft. Installation, these are universal, as are the shocks, so you don't have to worry about left, right. The larger opening in the mount goes down towards the bottom of the shock. The smaller opening goes towards the top. The fastener size for the Bilstein is actually a 17 millimeter, and there's a holding feature in the top that is a 5 millimeter hex. To tighten this down, normally you would either need some kind of pass-through socket or something else. You theoretically could get enough tension in it using a set of these soft jaws, but you got to be real careful not to damage the shock shaft. So I have a custom socket here that will allow me to actually torque this down while holding with an Allen key. So I'm going to go ahead and hold, and then what I'm actually going to use is a crowfoot wrench that I have set up for this. The torque spec is 25 Newton meters on this, so I'm going to go ahead and get this torqued down. So that was my 25 Newton meters. So that is now torqued. The 25 Newton meters is both the factory torque spec and Bilstein's recommended torque spec for this part. So I'm now going to remove this from the vise, go back over to the car, and we'll work on getting it fitted back up. So I didn't show it, but it's pretty self-explanatory. I did re-add the cap. I pushed everything back up and re-zip tied the dust boot here onto the new Bilstein shock. I'm going to go ahead and start assembling this. You do need to insert the bottom first. Make sure that the connection, the electrical connection, is pointed towards the back of the vehicle. So I'm going to snake this in. Make sure to kind of watch your paint, everything else. I'm going to work this down in, except I didn't have everything lined up right. So it may take a couple of tries here. I just have to compress the shock some to get it up into place. All right, so the shock is physically in place. I'm going to go ahead and start installing the fasteners here. Fortunately, there are stops up here that kind of hold this in place. You do need to use new fasteners here. I'll list the part number of these fasteners in the comments of the video. So I'm going to go ahead and get these started, and I will do the same for the lower bolt, which is a new nut and bolt. You do need a new nut and bolt, and the bolt should come from the front of the vehicle pointing towards the back of the vehicle so that the nut is on the back side. I'm going to get all the hardware in place, and then we'll go over the torquing. So I finally got the shock in place. Just a word of advice: work on getting the bottom bolt in before you get the top two bolts in. I originally put the top bolts in. It made it very difficult to align the shock hole on the bottom. So do the bottom bolt first, that way you can kind of wiggle the shock around to get the hole lined up. At this point, everything is snugged up, but nothing is torqued. So the upper bolts are going to be 50 Newton meters plus 45 degrees. And the lower nut and bolt is going to be 70 Newton meters plus 180. On the lower, you are tightening the nut, not the bolt. It is important that you do the nut, not the bolt, because otherwise you're not actually getting all the torque into the fastener that you're supposed to. The upper fasteners, once again, are 16 millimeters. The lower fasteners are 18 millimeters. So I'm going to go ahead, torque these to their respective torques, paint mark them so that I can kind of tell how much I'm torquing them, and then use a breaker bar with a pipe on it to get them the extra 45 for the uppers and 180 for the lower. Do not use your torque wrench to get the extra angle on these fasteners. All the fasteners are now torqued. As I said, uppers are 50 plus 45. You can see my paint mark there is now 45, about 45 degrees off the top dead center. And then, as I said, the lower bolt here, you actually torque the nut. So 70 Newton meters plus 180 degrees. Before I do anything to connect these electrically, I'm going to reattach the charcoal canister here. I'm going to go ahead, I just kind of clip this up out of the way. Be careful doing that. Obviously there's electrical connectors and stuff. I really shouldn't have just let that hang. You are looking to try and reconnect the clamp or the clip up on the top. You should be able to pull out on it and not have it move. There is an alignment pin down here, so I'm going to go ahead and get that fastener back. Go ahead and reinstall it. This is only supposed to be like 20 Newton meters, so just, you know, snug it up. You don't want anything to move, but don't crank this fastener down too much. So I'm going to go ahead and get this snugged up, and then we'll come back to connect everything electrically. Each shock comes with an adapter plug that goes from the shock to the Volkswagen harness, as well as two kind of special zip ties that'll connect on. The recommendation is that you connect the Bilstein side first. There is a top to this, so it'll actually face away from, kind of face out towards the vehicle or out towards the wheel. That way you still have access to the release clip here. You push it in till it clicks, double check that it is in fact connected, and then you are going to connect the Volkswagen end to the Bilstein here. It does click on, so no, didn't quite get it. So make sure that it clicks, make sure that it is in fact connected. Now I'm going to use some of the zip ties that were provided with the kit. You've got a little stud here and a stud down low on the back side, kind of hiding down here. The zip ties that were provided by Bilstein, they have a little kind of gripper piece here. It is made to push directly on, and then you'll be able to zip tie and secure. So I'm going to figure out the best way to route the wires here, and I'll come right back. After a little bit of trial and error, I think I have a mostly workable solution for attaching and securing the cords. So I used one of the Bilstein mounts on or zip ties on the upper stud that's on the same side as the electrical connector, kind of looped the connector back on itself. I'm not super happy at how that kind of cocked on there. I may try and replace that at some point. On the other side, get a view of it here. I tried to use that stud there, but unfortunately the I'll try and get under here. Yeah. Unfortunately, the Bilstein mount broke as I tried to tighten it, so I'm going to try and get a couple more of those to reuse that stud, because it was a pretty decent mount there, but it does do a good job of trying to make sure that everything is secure. You do need to obviously make sure that you are avoiding the rotating CV shaft, and you really don't want those cables rubbing on anything. You certainly need to make sure they stay away from the coil spring, but double check that everything is connected. Next up is reinstalling the fender liner. When you do that, make sure you've got this line right here, which is a drain hose from your fuel filler neck. Make sure that that is back out of the way. And then all you got to do is just reconnect all of the T20 screws that hold this fender liner into place. So I've now completed the passenger side mount. The driver's side is the exact same thing, except you don't have to move the charcoal canister. So the driver's side is actually a little bit easier. So it's same process. Remove the fender liner, remove the shock, make sure you support the shock to help get it out. Remove whatever parts you need to reuse, build up your other shock, mount it up on the other side. So overall, not too difficult of a job. Doesn't actually require a ton of tools. You just need jack stands, or obviously a lift. Please stay tuned. I'm going to be doing the fronts here shortly with some camber mounts from 034 Motorsports, as well as the matching Bilstein B6 DCC compatible shocks. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. I said keep tuning in. I'm going to be doing some more work, and this thing's going back to the track. So should have some good videos coming up here in the near future. Once again, thanks for tuning in.